Hello, I'm Joe, and this is Sierra Specialty Auto. Welcome to the shop. Today I'm going to start working on a brake job on a Clark C300-40 forklift. The 40 is for 4,000 pounds. These brakes are on the inside end of the axle end assembly, which bolts into the differential. So you have to take off the final drive essentially to get out the brakes, which are on the other side. This should apply to any C300 with serial numbers beginning 356. I've also done this same job on my Clark C500-45, and this information applies exactly to that forklift, any C500 with serial numbers beginning 355. And I have no doubt that this applies to a great number of other Clark models. If your final drive or axle end assembly looks like the one you're going to see here, this will apply for you. Before we get started, I've got a nice note and stickers from Paul Gattenby at the Knackler's workshop. He's in the United Kingdom. Dean Crawford at the Ayr Cave Shop sent Paul one of my stickers, so he's returning the favor. I've got that up on the big board here. I want to thank Paul for thinking of me and sending me this nice note and the stickers. Check Paul's channel out. He does some interesting stuff. I'll put a link to it in the description. Now, let's get to work. The first order of operation is removing the axle ends from the differential. It was cold and wet last night. I did not get any video of that procedure, but that's just simple nuts and bolts. I'll put some pictures here showing where the fasteners are. You do need to get the forklift up in the air far enough to reach 3 nuts on the bottom. 3 bolts on the bottom. At least 4 inches, I'd say, off the ground at the wheels. It might be technically possible to do it without raising the lift, but I would think so easy to get the lift up in the air that well worth the trouble. Now we're looking at the brake drum here. This is the axle end that goes into the differential gears. This is the brake drum, and we have a typical circlip. After which the drum should just slide off. Might need a little persuasion, but here it comes. And maybe I see now why the one of the brakes didn't seem to be working very well. Look at all the garbage in there. This forklift was originally delivered to a fabric company in Los Angeles, and looks to me like bits of thread or little filaments. This stuff has probably started accumulating in here when this was at the original location in Los Angeles. The wheel cylinder is here, and there is a bleeder tube from the usual bleeder location on the wheel cylinder up to this remote bleed location. Takes a 5/16 wrench for the nut on the tube, the flare nut. I don't have a 5/16 flare wrench, so far on the 3 assemblies I've already done, I was able to get it just with an open end. Let's see if I can do it again. Aha, there it went. I'll put a picture here showing how this is a little awkward to get to, this one right here. If you can get it, it's the easiest one in terms of taking it apart. But if you can't get it, here's another picture showing the nut in here, which would be easier to get to and allow for possibly reinforcing the wrench with a pair of vice grips. And then once you get this out, you can get at that fastener, get a box wrench on it, and finish taking it apart from there. But we got this one, so I don't have to go to that trouble. I believe that's loose. Now we've got the brake springs, and I have found it easier to go ahead and remove the brake springs right here. Just typical brake spring pliers. Man, this stuff is dirty. Now we have 7/16 bolts that take a 5/8 socket. And I'm just going to take this whole assembly over to the parts washer. It's just too dirty to mess with any other way. Again, that is just absolutely filthy. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes off camera doing a bunch of parts washing, and then we'll get back over to the roll-around cart after we have something a little cleaner to look at. Now that I have this fairly clean, next job is to get the brake cylinder off. That'll happen quickly with some power tools. This is banjo bolt and fitting. We'll put these into the container with the basket with the parts from the other one. They'll go into the ultrasonic cleaner. Get a soft blow hammer, I'll tap that out. These wheel cylinders are cheap, like $17 on eBay, so the standard advice is throw these away, buy new ones. I spent 20 years professionally restoring brake cylinders for people with old cars, all kinds of vehicles actually. Since I kept all of my materials and tools when I retired from my business in 2013, I'm just going to put brass sleeves in these and restore them to better than new condition. I have the rebuild parts in open stock. I'll show a picture here and there from that process. I'm not going to go into great detail on that on the advice of counsel. I was told it would be not a good idea for me to do, let's say, a tutorial on sleeving of brake cylinders, but I'll show a shot here and there to give an idea generally how it's done. For the moment, I'm going to go off camera and get this cylinder apart and go put these parts in the ultrasonic cleaner. I have all my new parts laid out, including new copper gaskets for the banjo bolts. The only internal parts I'll be reusing are the pistons. Everything else is new. Got my correct hydraulic brake cylinder assembly fluid. Be sure all these parts are spotless clean, rinsed off with brake parts cleaner. Let's put a cup in here first. Give a guy a few years off, you have to retrain him. Nice new springs. And there we go, one down. Now let's move on to assembly of the backing plate. I'll note before we leave this section, these would be $34, 17 a piece on eBay. I believe there was shipping with that, but even if there wasn't, $34. I've got about 45 minutes of my time into sleeving and rebuilding these with parts that I already had. So that's, pushing $50 an hour for a retired guy. So for me, it was well worthwhile to rebuild these. For someone who didn't spend 20 years making their living doing this, I don't think it would be any question that it would be far more advisable to buy the new ones rather than mess with the old ones. Master cylinder simply bolts into place. I always use new lock washers. Almost always. There are very rare occasions when I will reuse an old lock washer, but that's very rare. Brake shoe retaining pins go next. I I anticipated that I had seal issues before I began ordering parts, so I had ordered new brake shoes. The two of the original shoes probably would have been usable, but the other two are deteriorating, I guess from exposure to the grease. I don't know how well that'll show, but this is coming completely apart. I can pick off with a screwdriver, I can just rake the material off of the brake shoe, and at the one end it's beginning to separate, the bond is loosening. So I'm really glad I ordered new shoes, because that pair for sure is junk. I should mention these adjusters, brake shoe adjusters. There are a couple of pages in the manual that go into great detail on the different variations on these. I'm going to call them automatic adjusters. When as the shoes wear and spread apart, these tabs, which engage into a slot in the shoe, are forced out with the shoe, and then the tab holds the shoe out to maintain the adjustment. And the book, as I say, goes into great detail on inspecting and testing these for the proper preload. I ended up boiling it down to just making sure that they would move, that they're not completely bound up. And when I put the shoes on, I'll try it into the drum and make sure that they actually will fit inside the drum. And then as soon as you apply the brakes, get the brakes bled and apply them, that will push the shoes out to the drum and take the adjusters with them. I don't see anything to be gained by trying to take these apart, and I think it would be very difficult. These seem to be pinned. Let's see if that'll show. There's a solid pin driven into a blind hole there. It looks to me like it'd be pretty difficult to get apart. And again, I see no need. Before I install the shoes, I'm going to put a dab of high pressure grease on each of the friction bosses, the raised bosses where the shoe rides. There are 3 of them on this assembly. Not very much. All right, so shoe goes over the pin and then turn and engage the locking lever here, like so. It barely sticks through, but that's enough. Now we'll put on one of the cupped washers and a spring. Well, first let's go get my tool. Spring, another cup washer with the slot lined up with the tab on the pin. Push and turn 90 degrees, and that registers onto the end of the pin and holds the shoe in place. And repeat for the other side. One more thing I should mention here. The conventional advice, standard advice, is always to use new hardware kits. If I was doing this for a paying customer, I certainly would. All the parts out of this brake assembly are in good condition. There's still paint on the springs. They're not bent. They're not twisted. I don't have any concern about reusing these springs. They're going to work fine. This is a backyard forklift. It's not going back into full-time service, so situation for this particular job means that I'm comfortable for my own purposes reusing the original hardware. But again, standard advice, buy new hardware, not terribly expensive. There were no lock washers on these bolts when I took them out, but the parts book calls for them. So I'm going to put new ones in. I'll have to get in front of the camera to get this bleeder line started. Now we'll try the drum. Right now we're just wanting to make sure it will slide over. Before we do the final assembly on the drum, we want to get this banjo bolt installed. Actually, I'm thinking I should have done that before I put it on the backing plate. Definitely install the banjo bolt onto the cylinder before you bolt the backing plate to the hub, the axle end. Try the drum one last time. Good fit. Retaining clip. And this assembly is ready to go back on. There is a seal in the differential that runs on this surface. I have a new one. I'll replace that. I also have grease seals for the axle stub, and obviously from the tremendous amount of oil that was in here on both of these, those seals are bad. They're going to be a lot easier to get to after it's back on the forklift. I can get into this end in the typical wheel bearing manner. So after I put this back on the forklift, I will get this cap off. There'll be some kind of a locking arrangement and a nut and a bearing, and back in here there'll be a grease seal, and I'll replace that, and this should be good for another 40 years. I am at the front of the lift with the axle end up on transmission jack, just about lined up. I've got 5 studs on the axle end that fit into clearance holes around the front of the differential, and there are 5 bolts that go in the back half of the flange. We'll get these studs started in, and they should line the assembly up and carry the axle end into the differential, the stub shaft, and get everything lined up. As I get this studs engaged into these holes, I'll have to lower the transmission jack a little bit. Shouldn't be too much work. there it goes. Now it's just a matter of getting the hardware started. 3 of the the nuts for 3 of the studs can be reached easily from above. The other 2, I'll have to get down on the floor and get underneath the lift. These 5 bolts can all be put in just right over here. They're easy to get to. I always use new lock washers, almost always use new lock washers, and this is why. This is one of the original lock washers, and as happens so often, it is already broken, and the rest of them are just waiting to break. No percentage in using old lock washers. If you're fortunate still to have these dust covers for the wheel cylinder access, you'll want to leave that top bolt out until you have this installed. Got lucky there. Got a bite with the flare wrench just at the right place to get that line tight. Very limited access in there. This is part of the dust seal to keep foreign objects out with plastic filler, and then the dust cover itself goes into place. I think I'm fortunate still to have all of this original hardware. As J.C. Smith says, that's torqued to factory spec. And that wraps up the reinstallation of the axle end assemblies, except for bleeding. I'll bring the camera around to the other side and show a few seconds of bleeding, which is exactly the same as it is on any hydraulic brake system. No different. I guess there is one significant difference bleeding a forklift, at least this one. One guy can reach the pedal and the bleeder at the same time. That job went well. The brakes did bleed out quickly, got a good firm pedal. In conjunction with this brake job, I'm also doing a reseal of the transmission and the axle end assemblies. I did not include any information about that with this video, which is already long enough. watch for another video in this playlist which will cover the axle end resealing of the axle end assemblies for the C300 and C500 and resealing of the transmission for the C300. C500 has a significantly different transmission. Don't forget to check out Paul's channel, the Knackler's Workshop. He's about to begin refurbishing a Deckel SO D-bit grinder. That's on my short list of tools that I'd like to acquire. Again, I'll put a link to Paul's channel in the description. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it very much, and I hope you'll visit the shop again soon.